Evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the SADA webinar with the topic Smoking, Vaping and Your Mouth. I'm Barbara Van Wyk, Professional Marketing Lead for the Self-Care Portfolio of KENVUE. And my thanks to SADA tonight for facilitating this webinar, where we as a consumer health company can share evidence-based science on topics that are relevant to the dental professional. Just a few housekeeping rules. Your sound and video are off. However, there is a live chat at the end of Professor Richard Van Zyl's presentation. So please put any questions in the chat and we will endeavor, and Prof will endeavor to answer these questions. That will be around about just before 8 o'clock or at 8 o'clock. So I'd like to introduce this topic, and I don't know if you know, but October, or should I rather say Stoptober, is an annual campaign in the UK encouraging smokers to quit for 28 days and also offering them support and resources to help them quit for good. In the spirit of this campaign, tonight's webinar is based on scientific research that Prof will share with us, but also as dental professionals, that you may feel more comfortable about having those smoking cessation conversations with your patients and how you can support them on their quit journey. So therefore, it gives me great pleasure tonight to welcome and introduce you to Professor Richard Van Zyl-Smit. Prof currently holds the position of professor and consultant pulmonologist within the Division of Pulmonology and the Department of Medicine at the University of Cape Town and Groote Schuur Hospital. Prof Van Zyl-Smit is also a principal researcher at the University of Cape Town's Lung Institute. He is head of the Smoking Cessation Services at the E16 Respiratory Clinic, also at Groote Schuur Hospital, as well as the head of the Adolescents Respiratory Services. He qualified as a pulmonologist in 2007 and completed his PhD investigating the effects of tobacco smoke on human pulmonary immune responses to mycobacterial infection in 2011. After a postdoc placement in New York at the end of 2011, he returned to UCT to take up a position at the Lung Institute. He has a plethora of published peer-reviewed research articles, is a very sought-after international speaker, has spoken many times on radio, and also has published his own book of a collection of essays of a frontline healthcare professional during the COVID epidemic. Thoughts on a Saturday morning. A very warm welcome, Prof. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Barbara, and yeah, thanks to SADA for inviting me. Let me just make sure that we're all up and running. If you can just confirm, you can see my screen and my opening slide. Okay, yes. Then we're good to go.
Great.
So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I did have a quick check. I don't see my dentist on the list of participants. She may have sneaked in when I changed up here, but at least she will not know how little I know about dentistry. In terms of conflicts of interest and declarations, let me just put this up front and then we'll dive into it. I've spoken on smoking cessation at various platforms in various formats and along with many other medications. I don't specifically have any conflicts of interest related to this topic. I am going to talk about the medication that is available, and I'll give you my personal opinion, but also some of the evidence as well. And you need to appreciate that there are nuances here, and we do have personal preferences, and I'll try and expand on that when I talk about it. And yes, these are all my own opinions. I think the other important thing to note is that I work strictly below the larynx and above the diaphragm. And so I know exceptionally little about the mouth and dentistry. oral hygiene. And so I'm not going to try and teach you a lot about what tobacco does to your mouth. The aim of this evening is to give you the other side of the coin, as it were, that when you are engaging with a client who you think may or may not be a smoker, or someone who's vaping, which we'll talk about, what are the options? What is the opportunity that you have when you have them in your chair, as it were, to talk to them about smoking cessation, because it clearly impacts on oral hygiene, it impacts on dental health, it impacts on all sorts of things. And so it's a great opportunity where you have someone, literally a captive audience, to talk to. And I know that certainly in the medical profession, training on smoking cessation is almost non-existent. And I would assume that within the dental fraternity, it's even worse. So I'm going to talk a little bit about smoking. I'm going to talk a little bit about vaping, because that's increasingly important to you. And I'll explain to you why, a little bit about nicotine, and then come down to the patient or client in front of you in terms of how you might start that conversation. What's interesting is that most smokers know that smoking is a problem. So generally speaking, you don't have to tell someone that smoking is bad for them. Weirdly, there are a few places in the world that you do need to tell them, but most smokers know. So the starting point is not to say, do you know that smoking can cause lung cancer, emphysema, and, because they generally know that. If you want to have a quick throwaway line, one person dies every 4.5 seconds from a tobacco-related disease. You could argue, why do we still have tobacco with us? And that's a whole separate talk and discussion. But the point is very well made, that the smokers know that smoking is bad for them. They don't need any further information generally in terms of lung disease, cancers. Now, even as someone who is, inverted commas, a smoking cessation expert, I had to go and look up the impact of smoking on the mouth, because it's not a space that I play in. Obviously, the mouth is the gateway to the lungs, and I know some of the things around it, but I was actually surprised myself how little I know about the specifics. I mean, yes, we all know about oral cancer, but clearly there's a lot more in the dental space than oral cancer. So again, not to tell you your job, and not in any way to suggest that I know anything about smoking in your mouth. It's useful, I think, from certainly from my perspective, to divide it up into the three kind of spaces: the cosmetic, the function, and the deadly, as it were. Cosmetic, bad breath, discoloration of teeth. Functional, plaque and tartar buildup, leukoplakia, gum disease, tooth decay, and tooth loss. And I said, you know this far better than I do. And then obviously the deadly would be the oral cancer. And probably most smokers who have engaged with you would be aware of the oral cancer stuff, and are very grateful that you're detecting whether they do or do not have oral cancer. But I suspect that most smokers are not that aware of the plaque and tartar buildup, the gum disease, the tooth decay, tooth loss that may be occurring or may be a risk factor from their smoking. And clearly, if there are issues and you identify them, that conversation then obviously becomes very straightforward. So if you then look at some of the other tobaccos, and I'm going to come back to vaping in a second. In the respiratory space, people say, well, I use a cigar, I don't inhale it. It's always in my mouth. Tobacco is tobacco is tobacco. It's the same plant, it's just processed slightly differently. And so if you look at something like cigars, you have similar rates of cancer, gum disease, tooth loss as cigarettes. Whether or not you have less lung cancer could be debatable, because you don't tend to smoke as many cigars as you do cigarettes, but it's the same stuff and causes the same problems. And so I think one needs to try and avoid the differentiation. And then what's not that common in South Africa at this particular point is smokeless tobacco. So the snus, essentially tobacco, chewing tobacco, that has a high nicotine, high sugar content, that's in direct contact with the oral cavity. There's obviously the chewing and the rubbing of the tobacco leaves against the buccal mucosa and the teeth, and there's a very high risk of oral cancer. So the popularity of smokeless tobacco in the Scandinavian countries where it is very popular, the offset of not having so much lung cancer because you're not smoking it, well, you get all the oral cancer. So again, tobacco is tobacco is tobacco. Hookah pipes, just by the way, is tobacco as well. And anyone who says, well, it's not tobacco is lying to you, because it's generally tobacco that gets used in a hookah. So we know that tobacco is bad, and there really should be no debate about the harms. Moving a little bit outside of dentition, there are a myriad of various diseases. What's interesting is that if you are going to engage with someone around smoking and smoking-related illnesses, generally, as I said earlier, they know. You don't need to tell them, and showing them these kind of nasty pictures is probably not helpful. However, I would argue that if you had someone who had a mild ulcer on their gum or on their lip, you could show them a picture to say, look, if we don't treat this now, this is maybe where it goes. But generally, the revulsion to these types of photographs don't work. If you are going to engage about specifics, it often is helpful to use the stereotypical specific. So that cigarette is doing what you think it is doing, and so that impotence generally is only important to men. So it's no point talking about impotence to women. You may want to talk about a risk for cervical or breast cancer. If you have someone who is very glamorous and really is concerned about their looks and their teeth, then that would be something to focus on. Telling them how much money they're spending when they're driving a Porsche to your practice probably is not helpful. So those stereotypical kind of what do I think is important to you actually plays out. And so if you want to talk about diseases and risks, kind of just be prejudicial and what's the word I'm looking for? Stereotypical in terms of the person in the chair in front of you. And that's probably not a bad place to start. So I've said a couple of times now that showing the pictures, talking about the bad stuff is not particularly helpful. So what we tend to do is focus on the positive now, because the positive messaging is far more important. So if you said to someone who's sitting in your chair, if you don't stop smoking, you're going to lose all your teeth and you're going to get mouth cancer, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is going to be, you don't know how difficult my life is. I'm going through tough financial times. I have to smoke because I can't cope otherwise. So the natural response to that kind of aggressive attack, as it were, is defense. However, if you approach it to say, I see you've got gum disease. Do you know that if you stopped smoking, that gum disease would improve? Then they're not in a defensive space. They're in a space to say, oh, I didn't know that, or how soon, or how quickly. So we focus on the positive. Now, again, I don't know whether it's the fault of the smoking cessation or the fault of the dentistry space. But when you look at the benefits of quitting, they all really focus on physical health, cardiovascular, lung cancer. And there's not that easy when searching to find how quickly do these things that occur in the mouth resolve. So we know from data from years ago, and I often make this point, is that within hours, you smell better and can smell better. So your clothes don't stink, but also your food tastes better. And that's often something that patients really appreciate. Blood pressure, oxygen, carbon monoxide levels will improve. Circulation, respiratory health often takes a bit of a knock before it gets better, because you get an over secretion of mucus from the withdrawal of the nicotine and the toxins. And then within a period of 1 to 5 years, your cardiovascular risk goes down, your risk for oral, breast, and other cancers goes down. And so, interestingly, in the pulmonology space, if you stop smoking over 10 or 15 years ago, screening for lung cancer really isn't an issue because your risk has dropped significantly. So there are huge benefits to stopping smoking. They accumulate over time. And so the encouraging part of any conversation is, do you know the benefits that could occur if you stop? And again, from a non-dental person thinking about that kind of conversation, you could have conversations related to things like tooth loss, teeth discoloration. If you stop smoking, you will have to come and see me less often to have your hygiene treatments to get the tar off your teeth. That would be a much better way of engaging than to say, well, if you don't stop smoking, you're going to keep coming back and we're going to have to keep scraping this stuff off. So it sounds very simplistic, but actually that rephrasing it is really important. So the person, the smoker in front of you, doesn't feel defensive and having to justify why they can't smoke. Now, I just showed you that little sort of video clip of what happens when you stop smoking to try and find out in the dentistry literature how fast things get better. And as I said, I really struggled. The only thing I could really find was the issue of tooth loss. And to be honest, I didn't know that smoking increases your risk of tooth loss. I know it had gum disease, and I guess that should have triggered the tooth loss. But your risk of losing teeth remains elevated for at least 9 years. I mean, that's quite a long time. So I wouldn't lead with that to say, you know what, if you stop smoking in 10 years' time, your risk for losing your teeth is going to be back to normal. Is probably not a great way of opening that conversation. But it's the kind of thing to say, look, these things take time. The longer you smoke, the more it's going to be there. There are some early benefits. And I found this little list on one of the dentistry sites saying some of the benefits of quitting smoking include, and there are a whole long list there that you will, I'm all sure, be far more familiar with than me. But it's about contextualizing the benefits. And if you have that data, I'd love to know it. I said I didn't manage to find that, and it's not really the specific point of my talk is to teach you about smoking and dental disease. But if we know that, again, it would be useful to put something together. We have a handout that we give to patients that tell them about all the benefits of stopping smoking. And within the dental space, that will be very useful to send them home that says, hey, within 6 months, your teeth will look better. Within 3 years, whatever it may be. I haven't seen something like that, and that might be useful again in your space. So let's move away from smoking and let's get to excuse the pun. I've just realized I'm about to say the pun, the hot topic, because it is a hot topic, vaping. So recently, British American Tobacco, one of the world's biggest, not the biggest, but one of the world's biggest tobacco companies, bought out TWISP. TWISP is that lovely, shiny, aluminium-looking vaping device that you can get in most fairly high-end malls. Why? Because the tobacco industry is interested in getting a whole lot of new clients. Our data, preliminary data, suggests that the vaping in high schools has increased by over 900%. So that's something like 20 or 30% of your matric class may be vaping. Think how many high school students you see and just say, okay, probably 20 to 30% of them may be vaping. Do you know? Have you asked? Has anyone told you? Have you even thought about it? And that's an interesting question, not to be judgmental, but we forget to ask these questions because the high school students won't volunteer it, and you may not be aware of it, and certainly the parents may not be aware of it. And if you're interested in this space, I would suggest having a look at this Netflix documentary called Big Vapes. It really is very interesting. So let me tell you a little bit about e-cigarettes. So they are reported to be 95% safer. That number is probably utter rubbish. And that's not the issue. The issue is, if you were not smoking, why did you start vaping? Because the risk of vaping is higher than fresh air, particularly for your mouth. And if you're an adolescent, there's a whole issue around vaping, addiction, stress, and that's, again, a topic for another day. And then if you are smoking, yes, the argument would be that if you stop smoking and switch to vaping, you're reducing the amount of toxins, but you're adding additional toxins that are not in tobacco. So vegetable glycerine does not exist in tobacco smoking. Propylene glycol does not exist in tobacco smoking, nor does cinnamon, vanilla, candy floss, and any other flavor you may think of. So you're swapping one set of risks and adding in others. And the e-cigarette started off as an e-cigarette. It literally looks like a cigarette, even has a glowing tip. Some of them are blue at the end, and you can understand what the name of that particular e-cigarette is. Then they got very fashionable, and you could attach them to your wardrobe. And nowadays, these modern third generation ones, you can actually adjust. They're just a fancy computer delivering electronic nicotine to you. And then the subsequent models, the pods, the Juul, the variety of ones that look very much like a flash drive. And so again, if you haven't seen them, do yourself a favor, just go wander past your mall and have a look, because there's guaranteed to be one there, or even just the cafe near you should have them in it, because they are unfortunately freely available because of a complete lack of regulation in the South African context. I did come across a nice little review article looking at the effects of vape use on oral health. I have 3 points, which in my mind would suggest that the article didn't have enormous amounts to contribute, which probably tells us that we don't yet know the huge amounts of trouble that people might be getting into. And certainly increased periodontal disease and caries. This vegetable glycerine is a very sugary type substance, and so your sugar content is obviously much higher than that of tobacco cigarette. Gum disease and oral infections. We've shown some data that with vaping you get increased adherence of, or increased expression of a factor that increases pneumococcal adherence. And so to get pneumococcal disease like pneumonia or meningitis, the pneumococcus has still got to bind. And so if you overexpress these binding factors, your risk for pneumococcal disease goes up. And then increased oral commensals and biofilms, often related to the various flavorings. So these are the same flavorants that you would flavor your food. Vanilla, cinnamon, you name it. It's the same stuff, but now just being breathed in. And so the fact that you heat it and breathe it in obviously has significant issues for your lungs, but also you're exposing your oral cavity to vast amounts of additional flavorings that aren't contained in the food you're eating. So I think if you're particularly interested, it's not a bad review, but there's a lot more that's needed in this space. Okay, so I've spoken a lot about the harms, a little bit about what you may or may not see in relation to your clients seeing you for a variety of diseases with their mouths. And I think it's important, and I lectured to my faculty this afternoon around nicotine and nicotine pouches and all the new varieties of nicotine. And so I think as healthcare practitioners, we need to inform ourselves and upskill ourselves so that we know what our patients, our adolescents are using, because they're often far more aware of things than we are. And you may say, oh, I see you using a vape pen, and they say, no, it's not a vape pen, it's a Juul pod. So there's a lingo, there are devices, and I said I would encourage all of us to spend a little bit of time wandering past the shops. And the young people that are at those shops would be more than interested and happy to chat to you and explain all the benefits of their particular products. But just so that you are aware of what's being used, so that you at least can have that conversation and ask with a degree of understanding about what might be being used. So that being said, why are we seeing so much smoking in South Africa? Why are we seeing so much vaping in South Africa? And I use this as a standard example that there's no good reason to smoke except people smoke for good reasons. And what I mean by that is that smoking has no benefits at all in terms of your health, but it does have benefits. And so, weirdly, smokers are thinner than non-smokers because nicotine has a significant effect on your brown fat and your homeostasis. And so, if you have someone who is a runway model and they stop smoking, they will put on weight. And so they're smoking to keep their weight down. There are far better ways to keep your weight down, but they're using it for weight loss. Then focus, concentration, and stress often come up. And so people use tobacco and vaping as an ability to cope with life. So it's not a good way, but it does help. And so if you look at these data, now this is really dodgy data, and I'm showing it just partly because it's dodgy data, but also because it's very instructive. This is data now from 2013 that ranked the most stressful countries to live in. And there is South Africa, number 2, just behind Nigeria and above El Salvador. Now, I would argue that many of those countries where they don't have data, it's way more stressful to live. And certainly if you're living anywhere where there's a war, I can't believe that South Africa is number 2. But it doesn't matter if South Africa is number 2, 3, 4, or 5. South Africans generally have a fair amount that they are worried about. We know this from our political situation. We know this from our financial situation. So if you take these questions, now this is an unvalidated questionnaire, but it's very useful to ask. Finance, personal safety, housing, security of your income, and issues with family members. You could take someone who lives in Sandton or in Camps Bay. You could take someone who lives in Diepsloot or Khayelitsha or George. These all apply. It just looks different. The rand is terrible against the pound. I'm not going to be able to fly overseas. Personal safety. I live in a violent neighborhood. I'm worried about being shot by gangs, or my electric fence is not working. Now, it doesn't cast judgment on what you're concerned about, but the concerns seem to run true. And so it's worth asking the kind of how stressed are you questions. Are there things that are worrying you in your conversation with people? Because if you recognize that there's a lot of stresses in the background, then just providing medication isn't going to help. The person needs to engage with that. And then the real challenge of addiction versus habit. It's not often easy to sort out, but addiction generally requires therapy and or pharmacotherapy, whereas habit requires behavioral change. Now, they may look like the same thing, but the addictive side is where the pharmacotherapy comes in, is what causes withdrawal. So just think of yourselves, how soon after you wake up in the morning do you have your first cup of coffee? Now, if that's within 5 minutes, I'm sorry to say you're addicted to caffeine, which thankfully does not cause enormous amounts of harm. If after this webinar you go and have a cup of coffee, is that a habit or addiction? It's what you always do after a meeting. You go and have a cup of coffee to relax. So there is the strange interplay between addiction and habit, and much like weight loss or exercise, getting new habits is not necessarily that easy. So what do our data show? So these are data from our smoking cessation clinic at Chris Gear, and effectively, what these data show is on the left is what's called the PHQ-9 score. This is an easy depression screening tool. 49% of our clients had minor depression at least. And if you look at these scores on the right, anger, anxiety, sadness, you will see out of 4, quite a lot of patients have 2, 3, or 4 in those 3 domains. And so there is a lot of emotional distress and mild depression going on in our communities, rich and or poor. And so when you're engaging, it's not to make the person feel worse about their current situation. It's to engage with them to say, hey, I see life is stressful. You know the benefits of stopping smoking. Smoking may be being used to help you cope with your situation, but there are other alternatives. Have you heard about them? Do you want to chat about them? That doesn't take a lot, but it takes a little bit of courage, because if you don't know about it, then you don't know about it. So the challenge we have on the other side, now I would suspect that most of you are not necessarily going to be prescribing medication. Say, here's your script for varenicline or bupropion, go fill it out. That may well need to be done at a GP level. But the role that the dental profession can play is to sow the seeds, to have that conversation, to get the patient at least in the right direction, to say, oh, I think maybe I should go and talk to my general practitioner about a prescription, or actually, you know what, I think I could probably just get a patch over the counter, or actually maybe I don't need it. And so the challenge we have when someone, if you were to come to me to say, I'm smoking 20 a day, I want to stop, I would ask whether or not the main element to help you stop smoking is going to be counseling, or it's going to be pharmacotherapy. Because if you've got significant nicotine withdrawal, and I'm going to show you some of that data in a second, counseling is not going to help. And if you have got huge trouble at work, finances are looking like a disaster, relationships are a mess, me covering you in nicotine patches isn't going to help either, because there's a lot more going on. And so we do have South African guidelines, conflict of interest here. I am the lead author on them. So obviously I'm a fan of them. But most of the time, I would think within the dental space, you're going to be in that top circle. Oh, I see you smoking, or I haven't asked you before, do you smoke? Do you not smoke? Okay, I see you smoke. Do you know about the harms and the benefits? Great. Have you thought about stopping smoking? No. Okay. Well, here's something to read, and that's when we need this little handout. Hey, we'll chat about it next time. We'll go chat to your GP. That's all you need to do, is just ask the question, raise the possibility of stopping smoking, and leave it. And if you do that every time, the data suggests that if you engage any engagement within the healthcare space, you ask simply those questions, you significantly increase the chances of someone seeking help to stop smoking. So you don't have to convince them. You just have to ask the question, have you thought about it? Are you interested? Do you need help? Can I refer you? And if the answer is no, leave it, come back next time. Even for the medical doctors, general practitioners, even specialists, the scary part is when someone says, oh yes, I'd love to stop smoking. How do I do it? And no one's trained in the space. And essentially, how you stop smoking depends on your level of addiction and how much behavioral intervention you need. And I said that can be a little bit daunting, but we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So the cravings. People talk about cravings. Now, what's really interesting is, and I would, if you're interested in the space, start creating your own survey. Just ask your clients, have you smoked? Did you stop? If you stopped, how did you stop? When you stopped, do you still have cravings? I have patients who stopped 30 years ago and still crave a cigarette every time they wander past one. I have patients who stopped last week smoking 20 a day. They're not interested, no withdrawal, nothing. So it's very individualized, this whole issue of cravings and withdrawal. And they generally do settle over time, but they can be extremely distressing. So irritability, tiredness, more often than not, you hear that the spouse says, please start smoking again. You are so intolerable. And I mentioned earlier, cough and phlegm often gets worse when you start, concentration, hunger. So it can be miserable to stop smoking. And this is where the pharmacotherapy comes in to help with the cravings. But if you still got a stressful job or you're bored out of your mind, the pharmacotherapy is not going to want or not going to help much. So how do you start? I would always just ask the question, do you smoke? And they go, okay, yes, I do smoke. And then you say, well, why are you smoking? When do you smoke? Obviously, what are you smoking? I smoke when I'm bored. I smoke every time I get a chance. I'm a complete chain smoker. I only smoke when I drink. That's important because the strategy becomes different. Is quitting a priority to them? If it's not, why is it not? If it is, why is it? Because if it is a priority, you can reinforce that. And if it's not a priority, then you can reinforce the positives of quitting so that it may become a priority. Standard motivational interviewing if you've done some psychology. How likely do you think you're able to quit? Also sets the scene to say, oh, yes, I think I can, or I've tried before, I'm really struggling. If they come forwards with, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, that's important because you already know up front they're going to need some support. And then the support around becomes really important. Do they have a faith group? Do they have a community group? Do they have a running group? Is there someone around them that can come up? Because you are not likely to be the person that's going to be there day in, day out, week in, week out, helping them stop smoking. You're likely to be the people who are going to prepare the soil and then either let them off on their own or get them into somebody else's space who can help, unless you are particularly interested in the space, and then it'll be fantastic to have more people helping with smoking cessation. And then I asked the question earlier about how soon after you wake up do you have your first cup of coffee? Well, that's the question you ask about cigarettes. How soon do you wake up? How soon after you wake up do you have your first cigarette? How long can you last without a smoke? And how many times have you tried to quit? And I would guess from a dentistry practice, the person who comes in smelling of cigarettes is going to be heavily addicted. Because I would have thought that if I was a smoker, I would make sure that I didn't smoke or brushed my teeth at least before I came. I do brush my teeth before I go and see my dentist, but brush my teeth, gargle everything so I don't smell like cigarettes. And if you can't last long enough to not smell like cigarettes, I would think that the level of addiction is likely to be very high. And so we would look at that and say, okay, how much is behavior? How much support do they have? How much do I think pharmacotherapy is going to be needed? Obviously, I would need to decide whether you're going to use over-the-counter or prescription medications. And so engaging with the particular individual, we would try and put that support in place. There are a variety of apps, there are a variety of websites, quit lines, all sorts of things that are available. Behavioral counseling, strategies for stress reduction, strategies for determination and grit. How are you going to get through that 10, 15 minutes when you get that craving? What are you going to do instead? Those are the kind of things we would talk about, and then decide on the medication. And I'm going to talk about that shortly. It's not always today that's a good day to stop smoking. If you've got an exam next week, or you've got month end or year end and an accountant, it's not a good time to stop smoking. You have to set a date somewhere. And so maybe when you're going on holiday, or maybe when you finished holiday, or maybe if you've got a religious holiday or a fast, those may be useful. Don't assume that just because the person is Muslim and they're going to have Ramadan and fast, that's a good time. You actually need to have that conversation because people are people. And so it may be a good time. Christmas may be an incredibly stressful time, and quitting for Christmas may just not be on the cards, despite you thinking, oh, that'll be a nice Christmas present. So have that conversation with your patients. So for the last 10 minutes, I just want to quickly talk about medication. Again, I assume that most of you will not be in the space of prescribing medications related to smoking cessation, but at least you know what's out there and can have an informed conversation. So nicotine replacement therapy, this is a picture of my now 17-year-old son wearing an NRT t-shirt. And then I realized when I first saw it that that's not an NRT t-shirt, that's a Nachi t-shirt, and realized I was a little bit too focused on nicotine replacement therapy and smoking cessation. But he's now 17 and he doesn't wear an NRT t-shirt anymore. NRT generally is considered first choice. It directly treats the nicotine dependence and withdrawal. Remember, I said it does not deal with your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or boss at work, but it deals with the nicotine withdrawal so that you are in a better space to deal with the stresses. So it's not to say that you don't need nicotine replacement therapy and you don't need withdrawal therapy. It puts you in a better space to deal with your stresses. And so it may be very important to give you that little extra boost. But if your stresses are so severe, just putting a patch on isn't going to solve the problem. Abstinence rates are not perfect with anything, and that's because we are human and humans are not perfect. And so it isn't always guaranteed that you're going to stop. But the nice thing is you can keep trying. As long as you learn from the last attempt, you can keep trying. You can use nicotine replacement therapy with the antidepressants, so something like bupropion you can use. It has very few drug-drug interactions, and there is data locally produced from a team of us that looked at it. You can actually combine nicotine replacement therapy with something like varenicline, which boosts its efficacy, but obviously doubles the cost. Of the group of antidepressants, bupropion or Wellbutrin Zyban, you might know it is an antidepressant. It has not, no one's quite sure why, a reasonable impact on smoking cessation. General practitioners are quite comfortable with the drug. It's not my favorite. I don't have a huge amount of love for it. It has all sorts of side effects, not that the others don't. But it's something that patients can try. It's also quite useful for weight loss in patients who particularly are concerned about their waist. Nortriptyline, this is not amitriptyline, it's nortriptyline. It's a breakdown product of amitriptyline. Not a great option, but can be used. And none of the other antidepressants have any smoking cessation benefit. Nicotine replacement therapies. You will, I'm sure, be aware of the drug Champix. It's called Chantix globally. It's a specific drug called an alpha-4 beta-2 receptor that partially opens the dopamine receptor and locks it. So you don't get the withdrawal because you're continually getting the dopamine, which is what gets released when nicotine hits the receptor. And then when nicotine hits the receptor, it can't open anymore. So you don't get that pleasure from smoking. It too has side effects. It has, I'm going to show that to you in a slide in a second, and it's been off the market for a while because of a withdrawal globally. There is a new generic that is available within South Africa, so we have that option again. So we really only have 3 options in terms of smoking cessation medication, which is not a lot for a major problem. This slide is very busy, but what I want to draw your attention to is the placebo arm. This is a meta-analysis looking at varenicline versus placebo. So let's just take depression, suicidal ideation, and attempted suicide. Just look in that placebo group, that's the middle column. 3%, 0.8%, 0.1%. So in people who try to stop smoking without any pharmacotherapy, 0.1% will attempt suicide. 0.8% will think about suicide. So those are not inconsequential numbers. They are matched with the medication, so the medication isn't adding anything here. But smoking cessation can be quite distressing. Abnormal dreams, we know that for a drug like varenicline, it does cause that, but even 4.5% of people without drugs are going to have abnormal dreams. Anxiety, similarly, insomnia is slightly higher in the varenicline. So stopping smoking is not without emotional and neuropsychiatric distress. And we've seen it time and time again that someone has got a little bit of mild depression or mild anxiety. When you stop the cigarettes, it flares because the cigarettes have actually been doing a fair amount of self-medication. So I'm going to finish with this quick slide, and then I want to show you a video clip, and then I'll summarize, and then I'm sure we've got lots of time for questions. So this is the kind of thing I mentioned earlier. These are the type of handouts that we have available. We've developed at Critics Care and the Lung Institute that talk about the benefits, what it's going to do for you, the positive messaging. And this is the kind of thing that we really need to emphasize. So I want to play you this last little video. This is a Thai government campaign for smoking cessation, and it is probably the best video that really gives a good message relating to smoking cessation. So we have checked our sound. I hope it's going to work. Let's have a listen.
พี่ขอไฟหน่อยขอไฟหน่อยขอยืมไฟแช็กหน่อยดูดเองจริงๆเหรอไม่ให้ฮะจ่าเลยดูดไม่ดีนะเลิกดูดได้มันมียาฆ่าแมลงอยู่ในใบบุหรี่ด้วยนะดูดแล้วหน้าแก่นะสูบบุหรี่เดี๋ยวก็ตายเร็วไม่อยากอยู่เล่นนานๆแล้วมันไม่ดีรู้เปล่าสูบแล้วเป็นทั้งมะเร็งปอดโรคโป่งพองเส้นเลือดในสมองแตกไม่ดีแล้วพี่ดูดทำไมล่ะคะ
I'm not convinced that necessarily would work in South Africa. I'm sure our kids will be given a few cigarettes by some of our smokers, but it really makes the point that you just need to be encouraging. Ask the question of when and why they smoke. Do they want to quit? What support do they have? How addicted are they? And then CBT is the fancy word for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's always about counseling. There's always something in our lives that needs support. And so you need to do the touchy-feely conversation about how you're going to manage your life without your cigarettes. And then the pharmacological support for the withdrawal. If there is a hint of withdrawal, you could argue that withdrawal therapy may be important right up front. But more often than not, the behavioral side, the life is difficult. How am I going to cope next week when I don't have a cigarette is a far more important conversation. And this is the brochure I was talking about. There on the right are all the benefits of stopping smoking, nothing to do with your mouth, I'm afraid. But this is the kind of thing we would give to a patient we saw with asthma or emphysema who was seeing us for another reason and wasn't particularly interested. We'd give them something positive. You can see the different images there. You can do it. You can break free. You can save your life. So again, we've tried to find a few things that are pertinent, that might in some way engage an individual. I often provide them with these 4 or 5, more of them, and say, choose one that speaks to you and stick it on your fridge. So just to remind you about why it's important. So I'm hoping we've just on 45 minutes. I think we are going to be well in time for some questions. That I've covered a fair amount of ground this evening. Again, I apologize if I was too simplistic about the mouth and the effects of tobacco and vaping. But as mentioned, you know that better than I do. But hopefully I've given you a feel for the kind of conversations that I certainly would have, and given you a feel for the kind of conversations that you might be able to have with those patients that you are seeing. Again, not expecting you to wave a magic wand and get them to stop smoking, but at least to raise the question, engage, and plant that seed that, hey, maybe if I stopped smoking, I wouldn't have to come and spend so much money at my dentist. And I'm going to
Thank you
stop
so
there.
much, Prof.
Take
Yes.
questions.
Yes, there's 4 live questions, and I would encourage the audience, please, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. So, Prof, from an anonymous attendee, about nicotinic receptors in the human body, are they for real? And if so, what is the role of such receptors in a healthy body?
So nicotinic receptors, there's a nicotinic and muscarinic receptors in the system. So the vagal system that controls your heart rate, those are part of the homeostatic mechanisms in your system as part of neurotransmitters. And so it's part of balancing your system. So we need nicotinic receptors because we need to be stimulated by a variety of things. Not only nicotine binds to these receptors, and so it's part of homeostasis. The problem we have is that nicotine, in a sense, hijacks that response. So dopamine is released when you eat, when you drink alcohol, when you exercise. That's a dopamine response. And so nicotine hijacks that pathway, and then you say, "Ooh, I feel good now after that cigarette." And then the feeling goes away and your brain goes, "Hey, hang on a second, I remember that feeling. Where's my nicotine?" And so that circle of on and off at the receptor is what makes it addictive. And so that's the challenge. Nicotine is not the only chemical, as I said, that does that. There are all sorts of things that do it, but it's that type of pathway.
Thanks, Prof. The next one, also from Anonymous. Is it true that smokers had a lower prevalence of getting COVID? And then the second part of the question, do you think nicotine patches and nicotine gum help in promoting health?
Okay, so 2 very interesting and slightly contentious, controversial questions. So in the smoking and COVID space, I got into trouble, and I know I'm getting into trouble when the tobacco industry asks me to support their lawsuit against the government. I came out quite strongly to say there's no evidence that smoking increases your risk for COVID, and there still is no evidence for it. And that banning the sale of tobacco was a completely stupid idea, because you're locking people up in their house, you are making them stressed, you're making them bored, and then you can't buy cigarettes. So people just buy cigarettes because they're addicted. Whether there is any impact on COVID with or without cigarettes, there certainly is no evidence that COVID is a significant risk factor. It is a risk factor for things like pneumonia, for TB, for influenza. But remember, COVID is a coronavirus. The others are influenza viruses, so they're completely different. So I'm still not convinced that smoking is a risk factor. And then, is it a lower prevalence in smokers? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that either way. And then also just remember that there's a behavioral element. Our minister at that point had that lovely little clip where she was talking about rolling cigarettes and passing cigarettes from one to the other, and that was the reason why you increase your risk for COVID. I don't think that smoking plays an enormous risk apart from the social behavioral side. So what's important to understand with nicotine patches and nicotine gum is that they are not, in a sense, consumer products. So although they sit in over the counter, it's not a cream or a makeup or it's a medication to help you stop smoking. And so they absolutely promote health because they help you get over the nicotine withdrawal when you are smoking. As a non-smoker, there's absolutely no reason to go anywhere near a nicotine patch or a nicotine gum. They're in no way going to assist you at all and probably will make you feel quite unwell. So they do promote health because they help you stop smoking. And so that's their role. When you come across the issues of vaping, Vaping is not there to help you stop smoking generally. Vaping is there for you to spend money and provide money to the companies because you maintain an addiction. So the starting point is very different.
Thanks, Prof. Another question from Anonymous. Is it not the addictive poisons that manufacturers add to the cigarettes that lead to addiction and health problems, and not the compound found in nature called nicotine?
No, so I would disagree with you on that comment quite strongly. Nicotine is clearly an addictive substance. We've seen that now with vaping, with nicotine pouches. We've got data coming out, hopefully in the next couple of weeks to months, on adolescent vaping across the country. And it's horrendous how many of these high school kids are addicted to nicotine, not cigarettes per se. There are certainly lots of chemicals that the tobacco industry put in. So something like menthol you may be aware of. So nicotine in and of itself can be quite harsh on the palate, the nicotine freebase. And so they add coolants like menthol to make the hit more pleasurable on the palate. And so that combination of added chemicals will make it more addictive. But the addictive property is nicotine 100%.
Thanks, Prof. We have a question from Verisami Youngapal. He's asking, the vaping market is just so powerful. Is there an effective weapon against that?
So the answer is yes, and the answer is you. I mentioned earlier, I did a talk to my faculty this afternoon. I have my best publication scientifically has 280 citations, which is pretty good going. I have a YouTube video that I did with Mnet that has 163,000 views on YouTube. On that YouTube video, we show a clip of a vapor that has 27 million views. So you're absolutely right. It is incredibly difficult to combat 27 million views. This face is not the face of YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. So we've got to get clever. We've got to put the facts into the space. We've got to combat the marketing with truth. But we are up against an enormous industry that's very, very well equipped. Even just influencers, I pay you a couple of $100 a month to put up YouTube clips to show you vaping or smoking. You get 10 or 15,000 views. Me as an academic puts a paper out or goes on to a news media site and mentions something. I'm not going to get anywhere near that. So it is a challenge, but all of us have the ability to influence all of those around us, and that's got to be our starting point.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. The next question from Benjamin De Bruin. What are the benefits and risk of a patient using Nicorette for smoking cessation?
Okay, so remember, Nicorette's the brand. Nicorette is nicotine replacement therapy, and it has a variety of formulations, some available in the country, some not. So patch, gum, spray, lozenge, inhaler, there are a variety of ways of providing nicotine to prevent withdrawal. So the benefits are clear that you do not have the withdrawal symptom because you're providing a dose of nicotine that offsets what the cigarette would, which allows you to engage your behavior so that over a 3-month period, you've put in new habits, new behavior, so that you don't fall back on your old habits and start smoking, and those withdrawal symptoms have finally abated. Whether the patch or the gum or a combination of patch, gum, spray, mist, that's really dependent on you and how you are approaching your smoking cessation. And in terms of risks, they are almost zero. The patch sometimes can cause a little bit of irritation on the skin, and so when we prescribe a patch, you just need to move it around the body. Don't stick the patch on the same place every single time. If you as a non-smoker decided to choose some nicotine gum or take a nicotine spray, you would be pretty unhappy with that because it's nicotine and your system's not used to it. So there are the odd cases of a little bit of irritation in the mouth, but generally speaking, they have almost no risk. And again, remember that any risk that they might provide is offset with the risk of ongoing tobacco smoking. And so it's used in that process over a 2 to 3 month period to get you off the cigarettes. It's not intended as a substitute for the next 6 months or 6 years.
Thanks, Prof. The next one, how does a patch deliver nicotine better than inhaling it?
So it doesn't. So the point with a patch is that it has, again, fancy marketing, fancy manufacturing, much like a hormone replacement patch, where the patch goes on and you get the slow delivery of nicotine through your skin over a period of time that prevents there being any time in the day where you have very low nicotine levels. Sometimes, again, one puts them on in the morning and then you're sleeping at night. So it prevents that drop in nicotine levels. If you have serious cravings and are in big trouble, then having a patch in the background to give you that continuous coverage, on top of that, a gum or a spray to give you that little peak that you need to get through it, is a strategy that gets used. But certainly the inhaled, the mist or the gum gets the levels up much quicker than a patch does, but we use them in a slightly different way.
Great. And the next one, does smoking lower one's immune system?
Absolutely. The list of things that tobacco smoking does to your system is enormous. My PhD was looking at tobacco and TB, and we showed that if you smoke, your risk for TB goes up. There's data on influenza, there's data on pneumococcal disease, and even wound healing. So if you're going in for major surgery, your risk of getting wound sepsis, poor wound healing, and infections is much higher if you're a smoker compared to a non-smoker.
Great, thank you. And then another one from Dr. De Bruin, does nicotine have a health risk to the kidneys long term?
So again, you need to remember within that question is that we have always had nicotine in the format associated with tobacco. And so nicotine and in the tobacco clearly has issues for your kidneys, but nicotine on its own has very little specific renal issues. It certainly can increase your risk for hypertension because it increases heart rate, endothelial damage. It can increase your risk for things like heartburn, and I said blood pressure. But in terms of renal toxicity, not specifically.
Okay, thank you. And again from Dr. De Bruin, does nicotine cause polyuria?
So nicotine is a vasodilator. So it generally doesn't cause polyuria, to the best of my knowledge. I said it increases heart rate and blood pressure, and it causes vasodilatation. So in the sports context, there's a concern of nicotine exposure and heat stroke because of peripheral vasodilatation.
Okay, thank you very much. And from Anonymous, what does the research show on the person that goes for the nicotine patches but can't break the hand-to-mouth habit?
So that's a really interesting question because that's part of the behavioral side. Some people are hand people, other people are not. And so that's part of the conversation we would have. And that was, in a sense, the great hope for e-cigarettes was that we would have something to use. Now, there is some data around e-cigarettes and smoking cessation. The data really is very, very poor. And it's not as good as we would have liked it to be. I think with the oral side of things, if there is that hand-mouth thing, there are a variety of different ways, carrots, celery, something that you can put in your mouth to help with that behavioral element is important. And again, nicotine replacement therapy is not for everyone. Not everyone needs it. It doesn't work in everyone. It's a very good option that we should always think about. But if you don't have significant withdrawal and you are that kind of hand-mouth fidgety type of person, maybe a fidget spinner, and your question about what does the data show? Well, the data shows that pretty much anything might help. Not a whole lot has been shown to be absolutely definitive. And so you've got to get creative here and find something that the person can do that doesn't harm, obviously, oral cavity. So chewing on tobacco or chewing on sweets is not necessarily a good option, but maybe, eating a sweet a day for the first week or two might just be enough, and you take the harm potential, brush your teeth, etc., to offset that. But switching to eating sugary sweets all day to stop you smoking over a 6-month period is probably not a great option.
Thank you. The next question is more of a statement, and I'll read it out. I have 2 recent cases of oral symptoms related to a nicotine gum and a nicotine oral sachet. In the one patient, the leukoplaky on the tongue disappeared in a few days after she stopped her nicotine gum. She chewed 6 to 8 a day and had a tendency to hold the gum in that area. The patient who used the sachet held it in the buccal sulcus and had rampant decay in his mouth.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely true and borne out by the data. So the thing with the gum is that you shouldn't be continually chewing it all the time. So you should chew it when you have a craving and then take it out. Now, some patients will chew and park, so you'll chew it and stick it up higher up. But it's a much better option to chew and take it out. And when you need it again, you chew and take it out. So it's not designed to be chewed like chewing gum where you continually chew it all the time. And so that's something that patients don't always know and or understand. And the nicotine pouches, which are now becoming very popular, is just that it's nicotine shoved up. I forget exactly what else is in the nicotine pouch itself, but it's just stuck there, and so you're getting direct nicotine effects, and obviously the flavorant and presumably some sugar that's associated directly to the mucous membranes and the teeth.
Correct, and probably what cause caries, correct?
Yeah.
Exactly what he found, yeah. Another anonymous question, can nicotine affect me if I'm always around smokers?
So I see the next question is around the risk of passive smoking. So let me answer both of those together. We absolutely know, it took us a while, that secondhand smoke is bad. That's why you're not allowed to smoke in restaurants anymore. The data took a while, and historically it was the wives of husbands who smoked at home that would then end up with emphysema, lung disease, and heart disease. The challenge to determine that was that you don't know how much you're being exposed to. So purely from a research epidemiology point of view, it's a little challenging. We do know that there are significant chemicals in tobacco smoke, not as much as you would get if you smoke yourself. But that's why the law is there to say you may not smoke in cars, you may not smoke in buildings, you may not smoke around children. There's even a law that says you're not allowed to smoke within a car with a child under the age of 13. All the taxi drivers you see smoking, that's all illegal. That's there to protect you because the evidence is there enough to say you should not be exposed to someone who is smoking.
Thank you. And another question from Anonymous. Does it not worry you that you are transgressing people's free choice and freedom to smoke or not to smoke?
So it's a long discussion. Your freedom to choose to smoke impinges on the health of the economy because we have to pay for your healthcare in future. Your freedom to choose to smoke shouldn't impinge on my rights, and it's the same of me playing loud music in my house. That's all good for me, but I'm now impinging on your rights. And so the benefit risk here is that you protect the non-consumer. And so you're not allowed to smoke in a place where there are non-smokers. If you choose to be in a place where there are smokers, then there are rules and regulations around that. But it is a tricky ethical, philosophical, legal debate. But the law is on the side of the non-consumer to protect their rights over and above those that choose to smoke.
Great, thank you. Prof Gilman has put there his book title, Treating Nicotine Dependence with Nitrous Oxide Oxygen. I think
I
it's
haven't
more
read
a
it. I'll
statement.
need to go and have a look.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Prof. Appreciate that. And then another question from Dr. De Bruin. Does the consistent intake of sweetener via a vape cause a chronic stimulation of insulin production by the pancreas, which in turn may lead to insulin resistance?
I think what's probably more important, the sweeteners in vaping liquid are not large volume. The nicotine is definitely far more a concern with insulin release, insulin resistance, changing your metabolism. So I think the nicotine is certainly going to be far more problematic systemically. I think the sweeteners and the sugars in your mouth are going to be far more problematic from a local perspective rather than a systemic perspective.
Thank you. I see we've got 9 minutes left and we've got 2 questions. So I think we'll be able to answer all the questions live tonight. Another anonymous question. Is the revenue from taxation of tobacco that contributes to the fiscus, that in turn contributes to the welfare of a country, important? This money might even fund our tertiary institutions, including the dental faculties and maybe even the Lung Institute. Does this argument worry you?
So the Lung Institute receives no funding from the government, so it's a private funded institute. So I'm not too worried about the tobacco industry or funding the Lung Institute. That being said, it is an argument that is often overstated. So there's several arguments in this space, often promoted quite vehemently by the tobacco industry. So from a production point of view, the argument is that you need to allow people to make or grow tobacco because it's livelihood. There's good data, good research out that you can convert tobacco farmers to non-tobacco crops and actually become far more productive, economically stable, and growing tobacco, handling tobacco increases your risk for cancer. So tobacco farmers are themselves at risk for cancer. In terms of revenue, you're absolutely right. There's an enormous amount of money from taxation that's brought into the government. The New Zealand government, probably 9 to 10 months ago, said that they were going to do a legacy law, which means anyone born after 2000 would never be allowed to buy cigarettes, and they would just increase that age. So this current crop of adolescents would never be allowed to, it'll be illegal all the way up. They turned that law around because someone decided that they wanted the money. If you look at the costs of nicotine tobacco to the healthcare system, it's billions of rands that get spent on tobacco-related disease and disorders. And there are many, many studies from various parts in the world showing that economically, you're saving on short-term, long-term loss of productivity, disease management way outstrips any loss to the fiscus. Obviously, it's an acute thing that if we stopped people smoking today, no one smoked again, we would still end up having to treat lots of people with long-term smoking-related illness. So that catch-up is a problem, which is why, in all reality, no one is going to ban this tobacco completely in any country because it's just not financially viable. That being said, there's no reason why the tobacco industry, vaping industry, should be able to advertise to young adolescents on TikTok, on Instagram, on Cartoon Network, which Jewel did, to entice a whole group of young people into that space. If you wish to buy it, you should be able to go to a shop and choose what you want and buy it. There's absolutely no reason to advertise it and get new consumers. And that's really where the argument with the law is coming in, to say there's no need to create new smokers. The tobacco industry would argue we should be free to entice anyone we wish to use our products. And that's where the rubber hits the road.
Thanks, Prof. And for our last question, as we are bang on time. So last one, are the effects of nicotine in vapes the same as in cigarettes in terms of causing vasoconstriction of the blood vessels?
I was going to dive into a long answer to that, but I'll give you a short answer. So we now have synthetic nicotine. So nicotine that in theory is different. The only difference you need to be aware of is the free-base nicotine versus the nicotine salt. So the nicotine salt is the one that's in vaping liquids that gets quickly absorbed, that poses greater risk for addiction. But once in the system, nicotine can be in an S or an R format. Nicotine is nicotine. It does the same thing. It's the volume. Your volume of exposure to nicotine in vapes is likely to be way higher than your volume of exposure to cigarettes, because you tend to vape continually most of the day, whereas you smoke intermittently. So it's the same stuff. It enters the system slightly differently, but causes the same set of problems. So nicotine is nicotine, very much like tobacco is tobacco.
Thank you, Prof. And that's a wrap-up of this webinar tonight. We are very grateful for your attendance, and we wish you a good evening further. And I hope with the insights that Prof has shared with us, those smoking cessation questions that you can ask your patients, you're feeling far more comfortable in answering or asking them. Prof, thank you very much for your time.
Absolute pleasure, as
Very
always.
valued. Thank you. And also to Rose and Norma, that are the facilitators as SADA hosts. Thank you very much. And a good evening to all of you.
Brilliant,
And we
everyone.
wish you well.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.